Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know what's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Micky to Life.
Yeah, Micky's the best. He's always got something cool going on. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe.
Hi, everyone, and I'm Sunny.
And you've joined us for another deep dive. It's June 2025, and wow, the world feels, well, it feels pretty complex right now, doesn't it?
It really does. A lot going on.
Yeah. So today we're diving into a whole stack of information. We're going to look at, the latest on tariffs and trade, what's up with the global economy, the whole escalating situation between Israel and Iran, which is intense. And then we'll kind of step back and see if any of that looks familiar when we think about Taiwan and China.
Absolutely. And our mission really is just to help you cut through all the noise on these big global issues, get to the core of what's happening and, understand why it matters right now. Think of it as your shortcut to, well, hopefully being pretty well informed on some heavy topics.
Exactly. Your cheat sheet. Let's jump right in. First up, tariffs. Gosh, it feels like this constant cloud hanging over trade, doesn't it?
It really does. And, right now, maybe the biggest takeaway is that a lot of companies are just hitting pause.
Hitting pause. How so?
Well, they're basically waiting to see how all these tariff policies are actually going to shake out before they make any big moves, especially like changing prices.
Ah, okay. So they don't want to hike prices if maybe the tariffs won't stick or they'll change again soon. Is that the idea?
Precisely, yeah. It's kind of like waiting for the final weather forecast before you decide whether you really need that heavy coat for your trip,
Makes sense.
We're seeing businesses looking at July and August of this year. Those seem to be key moments where they might just have to bite the bullet and, adjust things, prices, where they get their stuff from.
Gotcha. And the main event in the tariff world, it's still U.S.-China, right?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, China is absolutely central to U.S. tariff policy. I mean, we've already got pretty hefty tariffs in place, right? Up to 25% on a lot of goods.
Right.
And the U.S. is actively watching for ways companies might try to get around those, maybe shipping goods through, I don't know, Vietnam or Malaysia first.
Trying to play tariff hopscotch, basically.
You got it. Exactly. And one thing that makes these tariffs so sticky, so hard to change, is that the U.S. often frames them in terms of national security. And once you slap that label on something, it becomes incredibly difficult to negotiate away. Really sensitive areas like advanced tech, think super high-end computer chips or critical stuff like rare earths.
Which are in everything. Phones, jets.
Everything. Yeah. That stuff seems pretty much off the table for any real compromise with China.
Okay, so if companies can't easily dodge these tariffs, what does that actually mean for, for us?
Yeah.
When we're shopping, browsing online?
Yeah, well, this is where it kind of hits home, right? If companies can't just absorb the extra cost from higher tariffs, what do?
Pass it on.
They pass it on. So yeah, you could definitely see higher prices down the line. Electronics, maybe clothing, even car parts, the final price tag you see. It could start reflecting all this trade tension.
Seeing your phone bill just creep up,
Yep.
or suddenly that shirt costs more. That makes it very real.
It does.
So what about China? Are they just taking this? What's their potential move?
No, they're not just standing still. China definitely has the option to retaliate. They could put their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Like what?
Well, they could target things like farm products, agricultural goods, which obviously hits certain U.S. states and industries pretty hard. Or maybe specific high-tech products. It becomes this tit-for-tat thing that just, ramps up the tension.
Okay, so it sounds like U.S.-China is really the main stage here. What about other big trade partners? Europe?
Yeah, well, talks with places like the European Union, they haven't really led to major breakthroughs, seems like, but maybe some key individual partners, think Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, they might get extensions on some tariff deadlines, maybe pushed past July 9th.
So the focus is really laser beamed on Beijing right now.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, so summing up the tariff scene, loads of uncertainty. Businesses are kind of waiting and seeing. U.S.-China is the big slash point, often tangled up with this national security angle, which makes it super sticky.
Yeah.
And the bottom line for you listening, could be higher prices eventually.
That pretty much nails the landscape there. Yeah. Trade policy isn't just some abstract thing. It can have real costs for everyone.
All right, so let's pull back a bit from just the trade wars. What about the overall global economic picture? What's the vibe out there?
Well, specifically for the U.S. economy, it's interesting. Some analysts are actually describing it as being in a bit of a Goldilocks state right now.
Goldilocks, like not too hot, not too cold. That sounds almost calm compared to everything else.
Yeah, it kind of does. And there are some signs pointing that way. Like recent data showed the U.S. dollar hitting a 3-year low. Yeah. That can actually help U.S. exports, make them cheaper overseas.
Okay.
And we've seen pretty solid demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Yeah. That usually signals, global investors still feel pretty confident in the U.S.
Okay, so the U.S. porridge is maybe just right for the moment.
Right.
But isn't there that huge elephant in the room? Debt. The U.S. debt.
Oh, yeah. There is, absolutely. And we have heard warnings, from pretty senior people like the former Fed vice chair. They're saying, look, the U.S. debt problem, it's real. And it will eventually become a significant issue.
Eventually.
Yeah. The key is their thinking seems to be it's likely a problem for down the road, probably not something that blows up in the next, say, 5 years. So, yeah, the debt cliff exists, but maybe we're not right at the edge just yet.
Phew. Okay. Little breathing room there, maybe. What about the rest of the world, though? Is it all Goldilocks out there?
Not really, no. There's a pretty strong view circulating that the world is becoming more fragmented.
Fragmented, like pieces breaking apart.
Yeah, kind of. Think of it like puzzle pieces that used to fit together pretty smoothly. Now maybe the edges are getting jagged. They're not quite lining up anymore.
Okay.
And this fragmentation, well, it could mean the global economy gets a lot bumpier. We could see, more volatile business cycles, maybe more instability in the markets as different countries or regions kind of pull away from each other.
Huh. So maybe this U.S. Goldilocks thing is just like a temporary pocket of calm in what could be a stormier global ocean.
That's definitely the worry. But, there's also the counter argument. Some people think the U.S. economy might still have this underlying specialness. Yeah, like its strong productivity, its track record of innovation. Maybe that helps it navigate this fragmented world a bit better than some other places.
So its unique shape helps it fit, maybe, even when the puzzle pieces around it are getting rougher.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And the U.S. isn't just, sitting back passively, economically speaking. Yeah. They're apparently considering things like higher car tariffs, trying to boost domestic car manufacturing. They're even dusting off powers, like, from the Cold War era.
Seriously?
Yeah, to try and speed up development of critical projects, like getting those rare earths mined domestically. So again, you see national security and economic policy just completely intertwined.
Okay. Wow. So U.S. economy feels kind of stable for now, but these bigger global trends like debt and fragmentation are definitely looming, though maybe the U.S. has some unique strengths. And all that trade policy uncertainty we talked about is still layered on top.
Exactly. It's all connected. And speaking of, deep-seated issues that can suddenly boil over, we absolutely have to talk about Israel and Iran. This conflict has escalated so significantly, and wow, it's not just about today's headlines, is it?
No, it feels incredibly intense. And the roots of this is hatred. They go way, way back, right? It's not just about the nuclear program today or recent events.
Not at all. You're right. The conflict is really fueled by these deep historical roots, ideological clashes, geopolitical rivalries, stuff that's been building up for decades and decades. The nuclear issue is like a critical current flashpoint for sure, but the hostility underneath, much, much older.
How far back are we talking?
Oh, you can trace opposition right back to the very beginning. Like Iran actually opposed the 1947 UN plan to divide Palestine.
Wow, 1947.
Yeah. And they voted against Israel even joining the UN back in 1949. There were apparently huge protests in Tehran, like 30,000 people back in 1948, against Israel's creation.
So this wasn't something that developed later. Mm-hmm. It was there from day one.
Pretty much. Early Iranian religious leaders, even back then, were already framing Israel as like a colonial outpost. Ayatollah Khashoggi, Talabani supporting Palestinian refugees early on.
Okay.
But the real fundamental shift, the turning point that changed everything, that was the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Right, when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power.
Exactly. And he didn't mince words. He explicitly called Israel the enemy of Islam. He called it the little Satan.
Little Satan.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredibly powerful, hostile language.
It absolutely is. And after the revolution, Iran completely cut off diplomatic ties. They basically viewed Israel as this fundamentally illegitimate state, a symbol of, Western colonialism that they wanted to purge from the region. That whole ideological framing became absolutely core to the new Islamic Republic.
Wow. So that really cemented this adversarial relationship.
It really did.
Yeah.
And from that point on, Iran started actively supporting groups dedicated to fighting Israel.
And that's where groups like Hezbollah and Hamas come in.
Precisely. Iran has this long history of backing groups like Hezbollah, which formed in Lebanon in the 80s, and Palestinian groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are often called Iran's proxies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Groups that Iran supports to act against Israel, often without needing direct state-on-state war. Though, these groups are involved in direct conflict too. Border clashes, rockets fired from Gaza. You see it all the time. There were even bombings in the 90s, like in Buenos Aires, potentially linked back to these groups.
And this all fits into that bigger power struggle across the Middle East.
Absolutely. Iran sees itself as this major regional power, right?
Right.
And it's vying for influence. Its conflict with Israel is a huge part of that larger competition, which also involves rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel's other allies. It's like this geopolitical chessboard. And Israel and Iran are just on completely opposite sides, often using these proxies or other indirect ways to confront each other. Add in provocative statements from leaders over the years, like calling Israel a cancerous tumor, it just keeps the hatred simmering.
Okay, so you've got this incredibly deep history, the ideological clash in '79, whole proxy strategy, the regional power plays. How does all of that history actually turn into the kind of intense, direct escalation we're seeing right now?
It's really a classic textbook example of what's called a conflict spiral.
Conflict spiral.
Yeah, think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts small, right? Just picking up a little bit of snow. But with every single turn, it gets bigger and bigger and faster.
Okay.
In this case, the spiral really began with that foundational ideological hatred, those early diplomatic snubs, maybe small conflicts.
Like the UN votes you mentioned.
Exactly. And then over time, it escalates. You move from just words and diplomatic opposition to actually expressing hostility through action, like funding those proxy groups, maybe some low-level attacks followed by small retaliations from the other side.
So little jabs back and forth.
Right. And maybe neither side initially wants a full-blown war, but they keep poking each other. And then the internal politics in both countries can push things further.
How so?
Well, often taking a hardline stance gets rewarded politically at home, right? Which means leaders have less flexibility. It reduces the room for error, for de-escalation, for backing down without looking weak. It just makes the whole situation more fragile.
Right.
And then eventually some major event happens, maybe, significant civilian casualties, or a strike that hits the other side's perceived homeland, or a really key strategic asset. And suddenly you cross a threshold. You enter this kind of no going back cycle of action and reaction where revenge starts driving the next step.
And we've seen specific steps on this spiral, right?
Yeah.
Leading up to the current crisis.
Oh, definitely. You can trace it. Iran funding groups attacking Israel. Then Israel's covert actions against Iran's nuclear program, like that Stuxnet computer virus years ago.
Right, the cyber attacks.
Yeah. Then they're clashing indirectly in the Syrian civil war, where Israel repeatedly struck Iranian targets inside Syria. Then, of course, the huge escalation with the October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel.
Which obviously led to much more direct Israeli responses.
Exactly. Israel started striking Iranian targets much more directly, including military assets, maybe even on Iranian soil. And then we saw that really significant direct Israeli strike on those Iranian nuclear facilities near Isfahan back in April 2024.
Yeah, that felt like a moment things could have really exploded.
It really did. It almost led to full-scale war, but somehow it was contained. Just barely.
Which brings us right up to this latest and maybe most serious escalation just now in June 2025.
Right. Israel launching these preemptive strikes, hitting Iranian nuclear and missile facilities directly. They apparently codenamed it Operation Rising Lion.
Rising Lion.
Yeah.
What was their justification for such a massive move?
Well, Israel's military put out statements saying it was based on high-quality intelligence. They called it a precise integrated strike. And they framed it squarely as necessary self-defense.
Self-defense against what specifically?
Against what they called a clear and imminent threat. They pointed to Iran's continuous aggression funding groups like Hamas, past attacks, But the core was Iran's nuclear progress.
The nuclear program.
Yes. They claimed Iran was basically days away from having enough fissile material for like 15 nuclear bombs.
Yeah.
And so the strikes aimed to dismantle those nuclear and ballistic missile programs before Iran could actually get the bomb and, use it or give it to proxies. It was presented as stopping an existential threat.
Wow. That's a very, very serious justification. Did they tell the U.S. beforehand? Did they coordinate?
So Israel did inform the U.S. about the action, but reports also suggest that President Trump had actually advised Israel against striking, at least before some planned U.S.-Iran talks about uranium enrichment could happen.
Oh, interesting.
But ultimately, it seems Israel made the call unilaterally. Afterwards, the U.S. reiterated its support for Israel's right to self-defense, but they also made it clear they were not involved in the strike itself.
Okay, so the U.S. supports Israel's defense in principle, but wasn't part of this specific attack.
That seems to be the official line, yeah. And the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, also put out a strong warning to Iran. Don't target U.S. forces or interests in retaliation.
Okay. And the immediate impact. How did this hit the world, the markets?
Oh, immediate shockwaves, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
Oil prices soared, right? Reportedly jumped over $80 a barrel on fears about Middle East supply disruptions.
Yeah.
Investors rushed into so-called safe haven assets, gold, government bonds. Stock markets dipped pretty much everywhere. U.S. futures, Asian markets.
So a clear, immediate hit to global markets from the geopolitical instability.
Absolutely. And analysts are now widely predicting this whole thing is going to fuel a long-term bull market in global defense spending. Countries see this, they get nervous, they boost their military budgets.
Makes sense. Was there any diplomacy even being attempted around this time?
Actually, yes, kind of tragically. U.S. and Iranian officials apparently had talks scheduled for June 15th in Oman, specifically to discuss Iran's nuclear enrichment levels.
Wow.
But obviously, these strikes happened just before that, and as you can imagine, that pretty much put those planned diplomatic efforts completely on ice.
Yeah, hard to have delicate negotiations right after a massive preemptive strike.
Yeah.
Okay, so the spiral just kept turning, leading to direct military action, market chaos, and stalled diplomacy.
It's really a powerful and worrying case study, isn't it? How these long-standing tensions and this series of escalating steps, even ones that seem small over time, can eventually lead to major conflict. And it really makes you wonder, are there potential parallels? Any lessons we can maybe draw when we look at other really tense standoffs, like the one between Taiwan and China?
Yeah, that's a critical comparison people make. Though on the surface, they seem so different, right? I mean, you don't have that same kind of deep-seated religious hatred or the decades of proxy warfare we just talked about with Israel and Iran.
No, that's absolutely a crucial distinction. You're right. There's no religious holy war element between Taiwan and China. And Beijing isn't, funding groups in Taiwan to fire rockets across the strait, not in the same way Iran backs Hezbollah or Hamas. The fundamental nature of the conflict is definitely different.
Okay, but could the way tension builds, the way things could escalate, could that have similarities, like the pattern?
Potentially, yes. I think we can look at the dynamics that create risk. One similarity maybe is that ideological showdown aspect. You have China's Communist Party absolutely committed to the one China principle, eventual reunification,
Right.
versus the mainstream view in Taiwan, which is really focused on maintaining the current status quo, preserving its distinct identity, its democratic system.
So a fundamental clash over identity and political systems, even if not religious.
Exactly. And there's definitely hostility there. You see it in how they sometimes talk about each other, how history is taught, how they view each other's governments. It's not the same as, little Satan, but it creates this deep, deep mistrust.
Okay. What about those gray zone tactics we hear so much about, like the cyber attacks, the planes flying near Taiwan? Is that part of a similar pattern?
Absolutely. I think that's a really clear parallel in the build-up phase. Those actions, cyber attacks, influence operations, trying to shake opinions, what some call cognitive warfare. And yeah, the constant military exercises, the aircraft flying into Taiwan's air defense zone, the naval patrols circling the island.
It's not open fighting, but it's definitely aggressive, constant pressure.
Right. Exactly. It's like the proxy conflicts, in a way, actions that raise tension, exert pressure, chip away at security, but without immediately triggering that full-scale war. But the danger, the real risk there, is that each of these gray zone provocations can kind of become the new normal. It gradually erodes stability, maybe reduces tolerance on both sides, and leaves much less room for miscalculation or de-escalation if something goes wrong.
So the gray zone is kind of like the slow, simmering phase of that conflict spiral we talked about, gradually heating things up.
You can definitely see it that way. Yeah, it raises the ambient temperature. And just like with Israel and Iran, there are absolutely risks of specific triggering events that could rapidly, suddenly escalate things between Taiwan and China.
What kind of triggers are we talking about there? What are the big worries?
Well, anything that Beijing perceives as a definitive move towards formal independence by Taiwan, like if Taiwan were to significantly change its constitution or its official name.
Crossing Beijing's red line.
Exactly. Or maybe Taiwan entering into much closer formal military alliances with external powers like the U.S. or Japan in a way that China sees as a direct threat to its claims of sovereignty. Another huge risk is just an accident.
An accident.
Yeah, with all that increased military activity in a pretty confined space, the Taiwan Strait isn't that big. You worry about a collision, a Chinese plane hitting a Taiwanese plane, or a ship collision, or maybe Taiwan shooting down a Chinese drone that flies too close. Something unintentional that could spark a massive response.
Wow. And internal politics. Could that play a role, like you mentioned, with Israel and Iran?
That's definitely a risk factor, too. You know, if China's economy hits a really rough patch, maybe the leadership feels tempted to use external issues like Taiwan to distract or rally nationalist support at home. Or, conversely, maybe a political calculation inside Taiwan leads to actions that Beijing sees as provocative. So yeah, internal pressures could absolutely spill outwards.
Okay, so the potential for a spiral exists.
Yeah.
But you said earlier the situations are fundamentally different. What are the big differences that might act as brakes on that kind of escalation in the Taiwan Strait?
Right, and this is crucial when comparing. There are very significant differences. The biggest one, economics. Massive amounts of money. Taiwan and China are incredibly economically intertwined. We're talking huge trade flows, over $270 billion a year. China is Taiwan's largest export market by far.
Wow.
A military conflict would be absolutely devastating economically for both sides, for China's economy too, not just Taiwan's. That shared economic interest, that potential for mutual destruction economically, is a huge, huge disincentive to war that simply doesn't exist between Israel and Iran in the same way.
That's a fundamental difference. Okay.
Well, the role of outside powers, particularly the U.S., it's different. The U.S. supports Israel very clearly, right? Military aid, diplomatic backing. For Taiwan, the longstanding U.S. policy is one of strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity. Sounds vague.
It kind of is. The U.S. supports Taiwan's ability to defend itself, sells it arms, expresses concern for peace, but it doesn't explicitly promise to send its own troops to fight if China attacks.
So it keeps China guessing.
Exactly. It keeps Beijing guessing about the U.S. response, which adds complexity for them. But it also means Taiwan isn't 100% sure the U.S. cavalry will arrive. It creates uncertainty on all sides. Also, there's much broader international concern about Taiwan's stability. Japan is deeply invested, the EU, the G7. They all regularly voice support for peace in the Strait. China would face much wider international condemnation and possibly sanctions than, say, Iran does over its conflict with Israel.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier no real proxies in the Taiwan situation.
Right. Any conflict there would likely be a direct state-on-state, massive military clash right across the strait, not channeled through layers of proxy groups like Hezbollah. Now, that lack of deniable proxies might mean a conflict, if it starts, could be faster and maybe even more destructive. But it could also make leaders on both sides much more hesitant to actually pull the trigger because the stakes are so immediate and so high for them directly.
Gotcha. Okay, so pulling that comparison together, while the pattern of tension building might have some similarities, the ideological clash, the gray zone stuff, the risk of triggers, the massive economic ties, the unique U.S. strategic ambiguity, and the broader international pressure, those are huge differences. They act as potentially strong brakes on escalation compared to the Israel-Iran spiral.
That's really the key takeaway from the comparison, I think. Those factors suggest that the path to a full-scale conflict, while not impossible, might be slower, more complex, and perhaps less probable in the Taiwan Strait than what we've just seen escalate so dramatically in the Middle East. Unless, of course, something really major and catalytic happens, one of those big triggers we talked about.
Right. Wow. So bringing this entire pretty intense deep dive together, what are the big lessons we're pulling out? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think the Israel-Iran situation serves as just this really stark clear illustration of how these deep historical divides, when they're fueled by ideology and these geopolitical rivalries, can lead down a long, dangerous path, that conflict spiral. You see how small actions, proxy fights, tit-for-tat responses, building up over decades can actually create the perfect conditions for major military clashes to erupt, even if maybe full war wasn't the original goal for anyone involved.
It's the snowball effect, like you said, but with terrifyingly high stakes.
Exactly. And then when you look at Taiwan and China through that same lens, that pattern, you do see some similar risks, right? The way tension builds through the gray zone tactics, the ideological clashes. But the analysis really strongly suggests that those very different factors, especially the economic relationship, the complex international dynamics with the U.S. role and global concern, they act as really significant counterpressures. They're like brakes on the spiral that just aren't present or are much weaker in the Israeli-Iran case.
So the brakes are stronger in the Taiwan Strait unless something really big happens to override them.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah. Without one of those major catalysts of, a declaration of independence, a really bad military accident, or maybe a direct confrontation involving the U.S. or other powers, those economic disincentives and the international factors make that kind of rapid, uncontrolled spiral seem perhaps less likely than in the Middle East, which just lacks those kinds of restraints.
Okay. So based on all this, what are the kinds of steps people hope for? What's the advice, generally?
Well, the general thinking, based on this kind of analysis, usually suggests, for Taiwan, the focus should be on maintaining stability, that status quo, while continuing to build international support.
Okay.
For China, the advice is usually extreme caution with military actions to avoid those accidental triggers or miscalculations that could spiral. And for the big global players, especially the U.S., it's about keeping channels of communication open, trying to manage the competition, and encouraging dialogue to lower the temperature and prevent things from spinning out of control.
These are just incredibly complex, high-stakes situations. But seeing the patterns, the similarities, and the differences, it definitely helps to understand the dynamics a bit better.
It really does, and it certainly leaves you with a lot to think about just in terms of how conflicts develop, how they escalate, or hopefully how they can be prevented.
Which brings us nicely to our provocative thought for this deep dive, something for you, our listener, to mull over.
Yeah, try thinking about this. How can seemingly small arguments or standoffs or even just these low-level aggressions like the gray zone stuff, maybe when they happen consistently over a really long period of time, how can that actually create the perfect conditions for a huge fight to eventually pipe out?
Yeah.
Even if maybe neither side really wanted it to go that far initially, it's that cumulative effect, the slow build of pressure and mistrust.
Whoa. That definitely puts a different spin on just watching the daily news headlines, doesn't it? It's not just about what happened today, but how today's event fits into that much longer, deeper story of tension.
Exactly. Food for thought.
All right. That was a heavy one, but really essential stuff. Thank you so much for breaking all of that down for us.
Always my pleasure. Glad we could walk through it.
And hey, remember to subscribe to Sip&Talk wherever you get your podcasts. Don't miss out.
And seriously, you absolutely got to go check out our old buddy Micky's YouTube channel. Seriously, he's got the funniest memes, great music picks. He even does wine tasting and travel vlogs. It's really cool stuff. You got to see it.
He really does. It's quality entertainment. Go check it out. Until next time, everyone, keep thinking.